It seems to me that the Apostle Paul gets a lot of bad press because conservative, even reactionary people, both Catholic and Protestant, misrepresent what he wrote to turn a progressive into a defender of social and political repression. Let me illustrate this by the adventures of Junia, sometimes pronounced Junia. She is mentioned at the end of Paul's letter to the Romans, where he sends greetings to various people, including Andronicus and Junia, whom he describes as my compatriots who were in prison with me. They are prominent among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. Given the way Paul speaks of these two, it's natural to think of them as people Paul regards with esteem. But for some in later generations, the very idea of a woman, Junia, ranking above Paul was anathema. So they changed her name to Junius, a male. Many Bibles continue having Andronicus and Junius, or Junius, but that's wrong. The people who made this change, I think, would probably be very upset if someone like me came along and pointed out that changing Junia to Junius made these two persons a gay couple. Well, now the cherry pickers I have in mind are modern evangelicals, some of whom claim to teach a full gospel. Problem is the gospel is full of misinterpretations based on poor translations, like the one I just pointed out. And I suspect Paul would not recognize what they are talking about when they use his writings to defend their nonsense. One example of this is a 4-step program leading, so the cherry pickers say, to salvation. The program poses and answers the following questions. Why do I need to be saved? What are the consequences of sin? How does salvation work? And what do I need to do? The answers the cherry pickers find in Paul's letter to the Romans are: we need salvation because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The wages of sin are death. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. If you confess with your lips and believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, you will be saved. All of this sounds pretty good, until, that is, you actually read Paul's letter. And that's because Paul had a very different agenda, which the cherry pickers prefer to ignore. So let's take a closer look by considering the context of these passages the cherry pickers have so elegantly picked. For the first one, I'm going to go back to verse 21 and end at verse 26 in chapter 3. I made some changes here to make it clear that Paul understands God as the active agent. And I use alternate translations based on footnotes. The cherry pickers fail to understand that Paul never tells us to have faith in Jesus. Instead, Paul believes that it is the faith or faithfulness of Jesus that achieved salvation that is now available to all persons. Speaking of all persons, if you go back to verse 9 in that same chapter, you find out that Paul is talking about both Jews and Greeks, whom he says are under the power of sin. So Paul recognizes that all of us fall short of our human potential. Also, the preceding phrase here, there's no distinction, means no difference between those in the Hebraic tradition and those from outside that tradition, Gentiles. Paul held universalist views and invited all people to recognize their capacity to be humane in their interactions with others. So, this passage does not answer the question why people need salvation. Instead, it proclaims that salvation is already available to everyone. Typical, I suppose, that these cherry pickers make it 4 times harder than necessary. If they actually read the passage in context, they'd realize that Paul believed that Jesus' faithfulness to God has solved the issue. We could end here, but I think we ought to take a look at the other 3 steps, just for amusement value. Another characteristic of the cherry pickers is that they are very good at stopping in the wrong place. In the case of Romans 6:23, they don't even take the whole verse. Enough said. On to the next. This 3rd step must be for backsliders, since the verse comes earlier in the letter than the one in the 2nd step. And once again, the cherry pickers have missed the point. The passage deals with reconciliation, that is, being put right with God. And again, it's not what people do, it's what God has already done. And finally, the 4th step. There's another way in which the cherry pickers go astray. For Paul, salvation is a communal experience, not solely a personal one. The cherry pickers' emphasis on personal salvation misses that point and allows them to ignore the social responsibilities involved in salvation. There is no point in building a personal relationship with Jesus unless one lives out that relationship by working to change the general order of the world and improve the lives of other human beings. The vision Paul had when he felt called to be an ambassador to the nations involved a total remake of the way humans live in relation to each other. He visualized a whole new order in which the wealth of the community supported all its members, and he believed that the followers of Jesus were called to live that new order in the present. So, unless the cherry pickers' salvation leads them to support humane immigration policies, to open acceptance of all sexualities, to honest dialogue toward equitable race relations, and balanced, even-handed policing, they will never achieve the salvation they so earnestly claim to desire. In the end, an honest look at Paul's writings leads to a life of supportive and inclusive service.